Welcome back. At this point, we've reached a particular interesting juncture in our guided tour of the written Constitution. We've talked about the Preamble, how the Constitution was ordained and established by the people. We've talked about Articles 1, 2, and 3, vesting powers in a Congress, in a president, and a judiciary, the legislative, executive, and judicial powers, respectively. We've talked about Article 4, which outlines the significance of horizontal federalism, the relationship of states between amongst themselves and vis-a-vis the federal government, and of territories. We've talked about Articles 5, 6, and 7, which showcase the idea of the supremacy of the Constitution, how amendments to the Constitution require specially broad democratic consensus in Article 5, how the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, notwithstanding anything that a state might say to the contrary, or Congress, or the President, or federal courts for that matter, in Article 6. And we've talked about how Article 7 completes the project, mirroring and echoing the Preamble, kind of a bookend to the Preamble, specifying the particular ways in which we, the people of the United States, via special conventions, did in fact ordain and establish the Constitution, and in ways that we did so that actually originally did not involve all 13 states saying, yes, we do, but originally only 11. 9 would have sufficed for the Constitution to go into effect among those states so ratifying. So that's where we are. We've come to the end of the original Constitution, and now we're going to start talking about the amendments. And we reached, as I said, a particularly interesting juncture because it turns out that the amendments are tacked on to the end of the document. That didn't have to have been the case. In many state constitutions, amendments are basically woven into the earlier document. In effect, the earlier document is word processed, and you get version 2.0 and 3.0, and it looks just seamless. But that's not how our Constitution, the federal Constitution that is, has in fact been amended. The textual amendments have just been added to the end chronologically as so many postscripts, PSs and PPSs and PPSs, like a careless written letter, a critic actually once said. But this is a reminder of one hugely important truth about the Constitution, that our Constitution is an intergenerational project. It's not merely the achievement of a group of founders, but actually a group of founders and amenders. Later generations of Americans are going to add these texts to the Constitution, and we're going to be able to see them, the contributions of these later generations, with distinctive clarity, because it turns out the amendments were added sequentially and chronologically. So we've been talking a lot about the founding era in the lectures thus far. The lectures going forward are going to carry us forward in time through a Bill of Rights that actually arose in the founding era and a couple of other early amendments, and then a later spurt of amendments after the Civil War, another burst of amendments at the beginning of the 20th century, a final burst of amendments at in the middle and end of the 20th century. So the juncture that we've reached is one in which we're beginning to close the book on the original Constitution and open the book on the world of constitutional amendment. And this seems a good point to remind us of just the larger constitutional project before I start to talk about the early amendments, which we call the Bill of Rights. That phrase, in fact, is not in the Constitution, and I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of this phrase, the Bill of Rights. But before I talk about Amendments 1 to 10, the first set of amendments, which in the Constitution, in the written Constitution, start right after Article 7. Before I do that, let me just stop and pause and say a word or two about this extraordinary intergenerational constitutional project and its world historical achievements and significance. What have the American people over the course of our history actually given to the world? And I think we've given to the world some extraordinary things, and these things are part of a larger intergenerational constitutional project. The project, in some sense, begins even before the Constitution with the achievement of independence, a Declaration of Independence, which, let's remember, actually gave reasons for breaking the ties that had bound the colonists to the mother country. So it was important that Americans actually put down on paper their justification. They submitted facts to a candid world about why they felt impelled to separate from King George because of all the abuses that had been perpetrated and how their petitions and remonstrances had fallen on deaf ears. Our revolution was organized around ideas and principles. It stood for something. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and certain principles were put forward. Now, those principles weren't always understood expansively. All men are created equal. Those words were penned by a slaveholder who doesn't free his slaves at his death, Thomas Jefferson. Yet those words would grow over time intergenerationally. Lincoln's generation would give those words a deeper and richer meaning than the founders did, and those words will continue to grow and expand over the course of American constitutional history, and that's what we're going to be talking about, how the words from early eras do get built upon by later generations. But the American Revolution was a successful military revolution, but it was organized around ideas. It does not, even though many people in America are opposed to independence, this successful colonial revolution does not end in a bloodbath in the streets with people slitting each other's throats in civil society the way the French Revolution does. It doesn't end with a kind of despotism that one sees with later Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution. As revolutions go, military revolutions, it's a successful colonial revolution, it's rather admirable. It's not completely bloodless, it's not velvet. There had to be a war. It's not quite like the Czech Velvet Revolution in the late 20th century, but it's pretty impressive. Folks who oppose the revolution are not guillotined. They're kind of voted off the island. They're politically ostracized, but it's still pretty impressive. There's a military leader who emerges, George Washington, and he gives up military power. He surrenders it. That's not true in most revolutions. These military figures actually hold on to power forever. The Fidel Castros and Ho Chi Minhs and Mao Zedongs and Lenin. So in the history of the world, these Napoleon, the American Revolution is pretty impressive, it seems to me. It's about ideas, and the dissenters are ostracized to some extent, the loyalists, but not guillotined, as will happen in the French Revolution. And this leads to a constitution. So that's the first big kind of American project, modeling for the world a successful colonial revolution that doesn't spiral out of control. And it leads to, and a revolution is a kind of negation, saying no to something. We cast off the English yoke, we reject that, but then we have to build something presumably better. To lay the foundations of a new government that will protect unalienable rights. That's the project, says the Declaration of Independence. It's the right and the duty of a people when they confront a tyrant to throw off the tyranny and erect new governments, to alter and abolish their system to make it better. And the first iteration, the first round of great constitutional reform, very exciting constitutional reform in America, is at the state level. A bunch of state constitutions emerging in 1776 and thereafter, and trying out different ideas, and there's some experimentation, and some state projects work and others don't. The Massachusetts Constitution, for example, in 1780 is put before the electorate, and they say yes, modeling what will become a federal practice in 1788 of getting the entire continent to vote on a constitution. So the first round is state constitutions, and a lot of them are written, and they have bills of rights or declarations of rights, and they map the powers of government, and they try to delimit the powers of government, and some of these state constitutions work fairly well, others less so, and there's a period of democratic experimentation, and then the U.S. Constitution comes along and tries to build on the best practices of the state constitutions. Massachusetts put its constitution to a vote. That was a good idea. We'll do the same. Most states have 3 branches of government. We'll follow that model. Most states have bicameral legislatures, not Pennsylvania. We'll follow that model. Pennsylvania pays its lawmakers. That's a good idea. We'll do the same thing. Pennsylvania and New York provide for a census so that when people move around, the size of and shape of the legislature changes. We should do the same thing. Massachusetts has a strong executive branch. We think that's a good idea. We'll follow its example on that, and New York too, and so on. So the framers are borrowing some of the best practices that have emerged from the state constitutions, and that's the next great step in this epic constitutional project, giving the world an example of a continental democracy voted on up and down a continent by people who had a chance to participate. I argued in the early lectures that was the hinge of human history. It was extraordinary. And that conversation that the Americans had up and down the continent is going to lead to future reforms like a Bill of Rights, which we're going to talk about very soon. So out of that conversation come additional good ideas and new ideas when you get people talking to each other up and down the continent. But we're not done. This intergenerational project is only getting started. It needs to secure this new fledgling nation, its security and geostrategic independence, and this is going to ultimately mean that Louisiana is going to be, that a territory is going to be acquired from France. You kick kind of the old ancien regime, the old monarchies, out of the new world. The most important constitutional decisions in America haven't always been court cases. They've involved presidential actions, like Jefferson acquiring Louisiana. Marbury versus Madison is the same year, 1803. But I don't think it's the most important constitutional decision of all time. It's not even the most important constitutional decision of 1803. It's the Louisiana Purchase. Remember, Marbury versus Madison says courts can strike down acts of Congress that they think are unconstitutional, but courts don't do that very often. That's the only time John Marshall does it. That's the only time actually judicial review actually occurs at the Supreme Court level of vis-a-vis an act of Congress for the entire antebellum period, for the entire period before 1850. And so judicial review is going to become important later on, but Marbury in context isn't so important. It's the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the United States, and now here's the next big constitutional project, taking all this virgin territory and turning these territories into republican states that will be admitted on equal footing, on equal terms with the old states. We're not going to colonize over these new lands. And that's an extraordinary project, a sort of an anti-colonial project. We're going to take an entire continent eventually and basically working our way from the eastern seaboard. We're going to work our way all the way to the Pacific Ocean, take these territories, and eventually turn them into states. It's a great, epic project. It can be criticized. There are losers in this project. The Native Americans are the big losers in this project of manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine. But we create, at the end of this, and it's an epic constitutional achievement, and it takes time to do, we create a continental republic of equal states, where no state gets to lord over other states. Lincoln's project, you will recall, is unifying the nation not just north and south, resisting unilateral secession, but east and west through a transcontinental railroad. It's an epic constitutional project. It will succeed in creating a great superpower. The next great constitutional project, ending slavery. Remember, the framers compromised with slavery. They created a house divided. They were lucky. We were just lucky that this Western territory wasn't all slavery. It could have been. Nothing in the Constitution prevented that. Fortunately, the Indians were defeated in the north in Ohio before they were early on, and so lots of settlement occurred actually in the northwest before it occurred in the southwest, and the path of expansion didn't result in all the territories being slave territory, as might have happened. And then, boy, American history would be very different, but it didn't quite happen that way, and but it was still a house divided. It wasn't all slavery, but it wasn't all free, this western land, and eventually a war will come. We're going to talk about that a lot in later lectures, because slavery in the territories was just sort of left an open question. But the next great constitutional project, and again, remember, we're kind of beginning to carry the story forward in time, so this is a preview of coming attractions. The next great constitutional project will be ending slavery, Lincoln's constitutional project, affirming the equal rights of black Americans, their civil rights, and eventually their political rights, their equal voting rights, preserving liberty not just against the central government, but against the states. That's going to be a great Reconstruction project, and all these promises are made. They're not fully lived out until really later in the 20th and early 21st century, but it's an amazing constitutional example for the world. Imagine how different the world would look if America hadn't ended slavery. And then Hitler comes along with his principles of Aryan supremacy, and he reintroduces slavery onto the continent of Europe. And that might have succeeded had America still been a slaveholding society, or a society committed to the supremacy of one race over another. But America wasn't that by the time Hitler comes along. America is an anti-slavery society by the time Hitler comes along, committed to a principle of racial equality. It's not living it out fully yet, but it's committed to that principle. That idea that all men are created equal has now been, in effect, written into the Constitution, and not just the Declaration of Independence. Now it's part of the supreme law of the land, and it means something far more robust. And we're still not done, the American constitutional project. Because of America's military might and its principles, begun in the Declaration of Independence and built upon, America in the 20th century will defeat Nazism and Italian fascism and Japanese military aggressive imperialistic authoritarianism, and a Cold War will emerge after that, and our vision will basically thwart Soviet communism, and in the process, we will begin to rebuild the world in our image, a Marshall Plan rebuilding Western Europe, taking Japan and rebuilding it as a more tolerant, democratic, open society, and Germany too. It's an extraordinary constitutional project made powerful by the geostrategic might of the United States, by Lincoln's vision to unify the nation north and south and east and west, and stand fast on the idea that slavery is wrong and must end, and ultimately the deep principle is that all men are created equal. But think about how many societies in the history of the world have ever sort of, I think, done as much as the United States has, from the Declaration to the present moment. And let me say one other thing about the present moment. In our lifetime, we are genuinely living out this idea of a multicultural, multi-religious, multilingual society where everyone really is created equal. We're beginning to really not just redeem the promise of these later constitutional amendments that promise equality. Barack Obama is President of the United States, pretty striking. People of all faiths are eligible to run for office, even the highest office in land, and people of no faith. It's open to all, low-born people, high-born people. Great cities like New York and San Francisco are places really where north meets south and east meets west, where people from all the world, from Asia, from Africa, from Northern Europe, from Southern Europe, are coming together in this new world and modeling, I think, for the rest of the world an example of a genuinely democratic, pluralistic, multicultural society. It began with the Declaration of Independence. It traveled through the Constitution and the War of 1812, the sort of re-securing independence and the Louisiana Purchase and the democratization of and republicanization of the West, the ending of slavery, the rebuilding of the house divided, the extraordinary world achievements of America in World War II and the Cold War, basically vindicating our fundamental values against those of intolerance and repression in the Ancien regime, and that story continues. So to conclude this lecture, and then we'll start talking about the amendments. The amendments are a reminder that our constitutional project does not end in 1789. It's an intergenerational project. The project actually is ongoing today. The Big Bang, if you will, of the founding, which created these amazing reverberations, a certain democratic momentum for America and the world, we're still feeling all of that. And what we're going to do for the rest of this segment of the course, as we work through the rest of the Constitution after Article 7, is carry our story forward in time, through a Bill of Rights, through the Jeffersonian era, and then Lincoln's generation, and then the progressive era of the early 20th century, the 1960s amendments, the Second Reconstruction, and up to the present. So stay tuned. Significance of horizontal federalism, the relationship of states between amongst themselves and vis-a-vis the federal government, and of territories. We've talked about Articles 5, 6, and 7, which showcase the idea of the supremacy of the Constitution, how amendments to the Constitution require specially broad democratic consensus in Article 5, how the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, notwithstanding anything that a state might say to the contrary, or Congress, or the President, or federal courts for that matter, in Article 6. And we've talked about how Article 7, end of the original Constitution, and now we're going to start talking about the amendments. And we reached, as I said, a particularly interesting juncture because it turns out that the amendments are tacked on to the end of the document. That didn't have to have been the case. In many state constitutions, amendments are basically woven into the earlier document. In effect, the earlier document is word processed, and you get version 2.0 and 3.0, and it looks just seamless. But that's not how our Constitution, the federal Constitution that is, has in fact been amended. The textual amendments completes the project, mirroring and echoing the preamble, kind of a bookend to the preamble, specifying the particular ways in which we, the people of the United States, via special conventions, did in fact ordain and establish the Constitution, and in ways that we did so that actually originally did not involve all 13 states saying, yes, we do, but originally only 11. 9 would have sufficed for the Constitution to go into effect among those states so ratifying. So that's where we are. We've come to the end. Welcome back. At this point, we've reached a particular interesting juncture in our guided tour of the written Constitution. We've talked about the preamble, how the Constitution was ordained and established by the people. We've talked about Articles 1, 2, and 3, vesting powers in a Congress, in a president, in a judiciary, the legislative, executive, and judicial powers, respectively. We've talked about Article 4, which outlines have just been added to the end chronologically as so many postscripts, PSs and PPSs and PPSs, like a careless written letter, a critic actually once said. But this is a reminder of one hugely important truth about the Constitution, that our Constitution is an intergenerational project. It's not merely the achievement of a group of founders, but actually a group of founders and amenders. Later generations of Americans are going to add these texts